I just recorded this entire video once, then had the file get corrupted, so take two! In this video, I want to go over what I consider to be the 10 best races within the fantasy genre, and the first recording I did was pretty much like the logical, like these are the most influential, like most often depicted ones, and now that I'm doing it again, screw that, here are my 10 personal favorite races within the fantasy genre, and the reasons why. Now, take into account, I really love influence, I really love reflections against humanity, and if they serve a general purpose, and if that purpose has evolved along with the genre. Those are all things I take heavily into account, including badassery and kind of just lore, culture, things like that. So let's go ahead and jump on into what I consider to be the top 10 best fantasy races of all time. At number 10, I figured let's go ahead and get the mindless horde out of the way. Let's take the pick that is just, here is the beast, the thing that is supposed to just fight humans, and that goes to Orcs, quite obviously. I was tempted to give it to Trollocs because I do consider Trollocs to be a decent evolution on Orcs, but I had to go for the OG influence here. Now, for every pick, I want to pick a number one influence, who was the best depiction of this race, and I was tempted to give it to Warcraft. They have certainly fleshed out orc culture incredibly well, and those orcs have more character. But when it comes to the purpose I believe orcs most often serve, there's really no better pick than the OG source material, Tolkien. Now, there's some misconceptions around the difference between orcs and goblins. If you go to the actual how Tolkien was using those words, they actually overlap and can really just be the same thing, just really differing in size. Goblin to hobgoblin to orc to Uruk-hai. None of that really matters though. What we are talking about here is the foil to humanity's armies. Orcs serve a purpose, and when we need a big epic battle, who do you want to bring in? Some mindless minions. And that is a trope within fantasy and has been since its heyday, and right now I personally cannot think of a better mechanism to serve as that big epic battle, one that has been done more often and more successfully than the orcs, and their reign, with how often they are depicted in other fantasy series, seems to go on forever. At number 9, I have probably my most controversial pick for this list, because it's not a traditional race, but a passing on of races into the next realm, and that would be ghosts. Ghosts typically serve a purpose to show the protagonist is having a hard time letting go of the past, or the wider world as a whole is having a hard time of letting go. They also serve a reflection of humanity's most evil traits, jealousy, envy, anger, wrath. These ghosts are something to be reflected upon, yet also feared, and I really like the purpose they serve for that. They've been a staple of the genre in the hardcore fantasy all the way to the looser fantasies, from D&D to freaking Beetlejuice. These things exist and serve kind of a terrifying yet essential purpose. What is the afterlife? What will happen? And why do we have such a hard time with coming to terms with our current situation in the now? That is, in my experience, what purpose ghosts serve most often. And for my personal favorite pick of the best ghost I think I've ever seen in media, well, I already mentioned him. I do believe it is Beetlejuice. I freaking love the guy, and it's not maybe the most influential pick on how ghosts are depicted forever, but screw it, it's my list, and Beetlejuice is freaking amazing. If you haven't seen the movie, do it. I love it. Now, for number 8, I decided to go with a race that has actually only ever appeared in one series. It might be a kind of controversial pick, but I believe Brandon Sanderson made something special, influential, and really magnetic when he came up with the Kendra. Tensoon is how we are introduced to this race, but we then get plunged into their culture and politics. They have eerie similarities to humanity while also feeling extremely alien. To me, the Kendra feel more like something that should be in a sci-fi adaptation, and I find them to be utterly awesome, but I just really found myself attracted to the idea of exploring this culture deeper. I was severely disappointed by the lack of the exploring of the Kendra in the second Mistborn trilogy, but in the first trilogy they served a purpose, they did it incredibly well. Their character, their presence, and depth of culture really earned them a spot on this list, and for this list to be interesting, I had to have a few picks that were real just modern fantasy. Come on, they're really cool, and down the road we're going to see some influence from them, so for me the Kendra were a clear pick for that. Next up, we have the penultimate antithesis of humanity, the evil, the servers of the Dark Lord in a very religious sense, demons. Demons have risen in popularity for the fantasy genre. They often bring in heavy religious influences, of course, and demons very often are the opposite of humanity. They embody our deepest fears. They can kill us outright or manipulate us and control us into serving them against our own will or purposes. They really do embody fear in a very real way. My personal favorite adaptation, though, when it comes to demons is probably Hellboy. Now, while demons do serve this anti-human idea, Hellboy really flips that idea upside down and brings us a demon who is incredibly human and actually fighting alongside us. Something that should never be allowed. The server of evil, something from hell, being a good guy, helping humanity out. If you have not made the awesome choice to read the Hellboy graphic novels and comics, please do. They are absolutely awesome, and I'm a big fan of the original Guillermo del Toro movies. I think they actually did the character really good justice. They are definitely a new age fantasy horror element, and they're not super popular in the more classic fantasies. If they are, they're very shallow, but recently they've been getting a lot more depth, and I'm excited to see demonic representation in the fantasy genre going forward, because I think it'll only get more interesting drawing parallels to our own worlds, religions, and ideas, and challenging them very effectively. Next up, we're going to stick with the darker side of things, and that is something that is, again, a classic fantasy staple that has only really risen in popularity. Coming to an absolute peak in the early 2000s, vampires have been massive in fantasy since the original Bram Stoker's Dracula, and their actual purpose within the genre has evolved in incredibly interesting ways. Originally just meaning to depict something fearful, something that goes against us in a very unnatural way, feeds on us as prey, proving we are not at the top of the food chain. From there, vampires evolved into a more typical action trope, being something to be hunted and killed, with characters like Van Helsing going from rather normal guys to these ultimate badass vampire hunters. And now it's a war. We're not the prey, we're an equal combatant. To then vampires evolving to a sex icon? Okay. But it wasn't until recently that vampires have been given due justice with very deep cultures, and the lore evolved to bring them into the modern storytelling realm. I'm actually very excited to see how vampires are continually handled in the future. I know a lot of people feel they're played out, and I agree, but seeing the divergence into the more animalistic vampires versus the actual kind of human and cultured ones is oddly fascinating to me. I like this juxtaposition, and it brings a nice little question of what exactly vampires are supposed to represent, who are they, why are they, and this de-evolution we could see two independent races or just a reconvergence into one. I don't know, I'm excited to see it. Now, for picking a best vampire, this was honestly the most difficult one to find a singularity in terms of what I think was the most impactful and most important. I was tempted to go with Blade for a minute just because of how fun and dumb it is, and it really embodies the action vampire I mentioned perfectly, but that wasn't really the height of the vampire genre and influence in fantasy especially, so I moved on from that and considered the amazing parody of vampires that we saw in What We Do with the Shadows. If you have not watched that movie, it's one of the best comedies of the last decade in my opinion. Taika Waititi is a comedic genius. But for picking a best vampire, I really couldn't go wrong with Nosferatu. This movie holds up fantastically. That's rare to say, and this movie's almost 100 years old. Think about that. It's one presidency away from being a century old, and the creepy, disturbing imagery holds up. No, it's not going to scare you as much as a modern horror movie with the best effects and manipulation and camera work, but there's something visceral about the way Nosferatu is depicted that just feels horrifying. The makeup and embodiment the actor wears is just incredible. I have a lot of respect for this movie and how it's able to just feel wrong and off-put you, really harking back to the original purpose the vampire served, being a hunter of humans, an unnatural thing that's supposed to displace us as the top apex predator. That's why vampires to me were a solid number 6 pick. We're gonna really shift up tone here and now talk about probably the most wholesome creatures in all of fantasy, hobbits or halflings, whichever you prefer to call them. And there's an obvious pick here for halflings. We're going to go with Tolkien. No one really realized their culture as well as he did. Now, Tolkien with his initial concept of halflings to me is very interesting. Those who are diehard Lord of the Rings fans know that Tolkien believed as time went on, things would get worse. He's hearkening back to a more simplistic, beautiful time. He saw the constant evolution of war machines and things like that from his service in the war to be evil, and the hobbits represented a more peaceful peaceful, wholesome past, and it really does appeal to us in the modern age like never before. Everyone kind of wants to throw off the pressure of modern society, go smoke some tobacco with hobbits, and just farm and chill and drink. It's a really interesting idea, the idea that progression is negative. Really, this goes against many modern fantasy stories and still holds up to being a fascinating conversation all these years after Lord of the Rings was first released. Having such a wonderful, holistic appeal, that is why hobbits get the number 5 spot, and they really are worth a whole video on their own discussing. That might be coming down the road, get ready for that. But moving on to number 4, we have the dwarves. Now, dwarves once again reflect humanity, especially in Tolkien, in almost a negative and positive way. They're amazing artists. They create some of the best machines and works of armor and weapons that the world has ever seen in Middle-earth. But they're not necessarily the best thing. Their greed ultimately becomes their downfall. We see this again and again when they dig too deep, etc., etc. But I'm actually not going to pick Tolkien's dwarves here to be the best representation of dwarven culture we've ever seen, because the dwarves don't really ever take the spotlight for Tolkien much. There's a lot of lore that goes around them, but nothing quite compares to the depiction of dwarves we got in the Forgotten Realms, especially the stories involving Drizzt and his time with them. Here, dwarves get character and culture like we've never seen before. They have a lot of the same philosophies and ideas behind them Tolkien first brought to the table, but then we also get the deep dive in experiencing who they are. If you have not dived into the Forgotten Realms series, it's certainly worth your time, a massive undertaking without a doubt, but a very well executed one. They're a staple of the genre, no question. They have influence that will continue on for good, and unlike many entries on this list, they have not been worn out in a way where they start to feel tired. Dwarves still feel fun to explore, and I enjoy them immensely, so dwarves take the number 4 spot quite easily. For number 3, we're taking a dive back into the darker side of things. For this pick, I just wanted to go for what is the ultimate embodiment of horror in fantasy. What scares us to our core the most? What is the enemy that feels insurmountable? For the number 3 pick, I think this has reached its peak evolution with Myrddraal and the Wheel of Time. I won't get super into what they reflect due to spoilers in the Wheel of Time. It's fairly specific to the world and series, but just on a visceral level, Myrddraal are something that feels unnatural. They take a lot of influence from vampires and a few other things to take the pale man horror trope to really its pinnacle. They have power over humans. They are faster, stronger, and creepy. Their sentience and intelligence only means they're a bigger threat. They seem to understand the world around them in a more intimate way than many humans do. They draw fear from us instinctually. No matter who the character is, everyone has an immediate reaction of terror to a Myrddraal. Their depiction and design is masterful, and the characterization they are allowed to have really lends a depth to the level of terror they bring to the table. Honestly, for my list, the Myrddraal are a solid number 3 pick. They serve their purpose perfectly. Now, as you've noticed throughout this list, reflections and juxtaposition to humanity are very important for me for certain picks. None serve this better than the elves, and picking a certain elf culture to go with or depiction was extraordinarily hard. It took a lot of consideration, especially with all the variants: night elves, high elves, dark elves, half elves, etc., etc. The list goes on. But for me, once again, Tolkien will take the spot on this list. His realization of elven culture and how they are the exact opposite of the worst sides of humanity while also having their own flaws is brilliant. They're beautiful, elegant, immortal, and powerful, yet their downfall comes from the fact they know they're on top. Tolkien believed in evolution of time. Every race has its time on top, and the elves is winding to a close. The age of man is beginning. This is terrifying and awful while being mysterious and wonderful to us from the human perspective. The elves embody magic and wonder, while the humans embody the opposite of that. The machine age, technology, progression versus the elvish, perfection. It legitimately brings feelings of sorrow to watch them leaving Middle-earth, leaving their homes, and losing the battle, honestly, against what feels like entropy. There's no fighting against it. It's going to happen. You just must let your race die. For that reason, the elves are an obvious number 2 pick. Now, what could be number 1? What is the number 1 pick over all of these other entries? To me, it's quite obvious. Dragons. Dragons have been with the fantasy genre since its beginning. I have intense love for them, and their purpose is quite clear. They are the goal, the quest, the end game, and I love them for that. Dragons are beautiful, insurmountable, and greater than. They embody so many elements of previous entries in its peak form. They have flaws, but they are better. They are the pinnacle. They are fascinating, they're worth research, and they clearly permeate our culture deeply. They still bring horror and feelings of insurmountable odds whenever they enter a page, even though they've been done to death. And for that reason, the number one pick clearly goes to dragons. Hope you all like this video. Like and subscribe if you've not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support the channel, and have a good one, y'all. Peace.